Hello, I'm Cheryl Espinosa Jones, and I want to welcome you to Good Grief, where we talk each week about the transformations that can come from loss. Today I'm welcoming Sarah LaBrie. Sarah's the author of No One Gets to Fall Apart, a 2024 New York Times notable book and editor's pick, and a best memoir of the year, according to NPR, Elle and Esquire. Born in the Bay Area and raised in the Third Ward in Houston, Texas, she lives in Los Angeles, where she works as a TV writer. She was most recently a producer on the HBO and Starz television show Minx. She also wrote on Blindspotting, Made for Love, and Love, Victor. Her work appears in The Guardian, Guernica, Lit Pub, Electric Literature, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, and her libretti have been performed at Walt Disney Concert Hall and the Apollo Theater. She's held residencies at Yaddo, UCross, and the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. She holds an MFA from NYU, where she was a Writers in the Schools Fellow. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me. Hi, Cheryl.
I'm very glad to have you, and I have to endorse the all of the best memoir mentions you've gotten all over the place because your book is very unique. I've read hundreds of memoirs for the show, and I'm here to say it really stands above. It's so beautiful. So thank you for that.
Thank
Love
you.
a good memoir. It's my favorite way to talk about grief, which is what we're here to do today.
Yeah.
So, uh, let's start with the inspiration for the book, which is that, as I understand it, and you can fill in more for the listeners, when your mother had a very serious schizophrenic breakdown, it caused you to sort of reevaluate a lot of things and led to a real grief event in terms of, you know, uh, understanding that her mental health was a loss to you. That's how I would put it. Um, what would you add to that?
Yeah, no, so exactly in terms of the inspiration, that was very much it. I had been trying really hard to become a writer for a long time, and I'd been working on a literary fiction novel that I had really high hopes for, and that I had put kind of 5 straight years of just pure ambition into, and it just wasn't working, and I was kind of realizing that it was burying me. And around that time, my mom was diagnosed with schizophrenia. She had a psychotic breakdown on the side of the freeway, and it just, my whole perspective shifted. I couldn't write fiction anymore. I didn't know why I was writing fiction. It made me question a lot of what I understood to be true about her and our relationship. And um, there was so much pain and so much grief rolled into that I didn't know how to articulate. So I started writing it down just to kind of figure out what was going on, what questions I even had, much less like how to find the answers.
One thing that just kept coming to my mind reading is that I think grief is a very creative process in the sense that you have to create it because you don't know where you're going. And then if you have a skill like writing, it tends to come out in that, I honestly usually process my grief by singing. But if you're a writer, you tend to process it by writing. So it's interesting that you didn't start out to write, even though you're a writer, to write a book about your mom. You started out to try to process for yourself. Yes?
Exactly, exactly. And I was also, so my husband is a filmmaker. And at the time that all of this was happening, he was kind of in and out of town because he was putting together a movie. And I didn't, I tend to be kind of at a remove from my emotions generally. So I didn't know, I don't even know if I would have used the term process because I didn't have a healthy relationship to grief or sadness or depression. I just, all I could, I would do the things you're supposed to do. I would exercise, I would go to therapy, but I was always just very, it was almost sort of a derealization or a depersonalization where I was just separate from whatever I was feeling. But I kind of reached a point where I couldn't separate myself anymore. And I had to confront that sadness that I had spent not only had I spent my whole life trying to distance myself from, but that my grandmother had, that all the women in my family, I think as a family, we were just afraid of emotion. And suddenly you couldn't get away from it in this case.
I think that's in the broader Western American culture true, but then I feel we each have our own particular relationship to that. And I've always thought, I'm part of a diverse community. I've observed a lot of people of color trying to process grief, and it's not really safe to have your grief in a visceral, like physically dangerous sort of way, where in my upbringing, it was more of a shame-based thing, like your feelings are something to be ashamed of. I think that's somewhat different. I don't know. I don't want to overgeneralize, but do you feel that's a bit of it in there?
I think it also might be a generational thing because I would say my grandmother, who is 80 this year, I think her relationship to grief is very shame based, maybe for a different reason, but because I don't think for her it was necessarily just about keeping up appearances, but it was more just like there's not the resources there, the therapy, the medication that wasn't an option that she would ever have considered or that anyone in her family would ever have considered. And it didn't make sense for her to think that her child would or her grandchild would. As somebody who was born in Texas in the 40s and kind of grew up in these small towns in East Texas and built a business in Houston. And she was really, my grandmother is the matriarch of our family. She's sort of the model for all of us. So that was just sort of the environment that we were raised in. And
Mhm.
I think for me, it's more it is interesting that you bring up safety because I also, as a Black woman who grew up in very white environments and private schools and going to Brown, I'm always very aware of how I'm being perceived, and it's that sort of Du Bois double consciousness. It's I'm me, but I also am always aware of how I'm being looked at, and so the idea of not having control over that perception in the way that sort of grief rids you of that control or sadness or strong emotion, not being able to control how I'm being seen is something that I think I was very afraid of because it losing that control meant sort of a loss that could have really big consequences for me, my career, um, my social life, all kinds of things. So
You
yeah,
don't
I
have
think
room in a way.
right.
Yeah. Well, of course, I'm well aware of African American people who have literally lost their lives because they were having mental health crises that then got perceived as some kind of dangerous thing. I think that's so much less likely for white people.
Yeah,
You
it's
just
something.
don't hear about that very often at all, right? So,
No,
love that.
it's something I think about all the time. It was something I was really worried about with my mom when she was at her most delusional, because this was sort of post George Floyd and the sense that kind of it felt like police violence. I don't know that if it had just like risen in the public consciousness or what. But I was very afraid that something was going to happen to her. Luckily, Houston, at least at the time, I don't know if it still does, did have a pretty robust um, department of mental health in that my mother was able to get resources for the criminally mentally ill. There were officers who were trained in mental health who could come and not know that something mental was going on, but she got, I was told, I don't know if this is true or not because sometimes with talking to her it's hard to know it's true, but that she was tased. I know that she was taken in multiple times against her will to mental hospitals. um it's just such a complex subject because on the one hand, she's an adult woman with master's degrees, education, a mother who has autonomy, but on the other hand, because her brain is attacking her in this way, she needed someone to sort of take control over her. And it's like you mix into that being a Black woman, it's there's no easy answers. It doesn't seem like there's any model for that. And that was really,
Let alone the simple, not so simple, complex, but the face of it, mental health, schizophrenia, delusional illnesses in general. I had a client once who was a Black woman. She had a break. She was very delusional. Honestly, her delusions made sense to me. They were metaphoric, but they were vivid. And after we weren't working together anymore, she jumped over the freeway overpass and died. And there's no way that she would accept medication because she actually believed in her delusions. She knew they weren't what everyone else was seeing, but she thought they were the truth. And how do you argue with that? There was truth in it, just not in the kind of everyday way. So it's very complex. It's very complex. Before we get too far, let's hear a little bit from the book. Can you read from the beginning of the book, give people a sense of that writing voice that you have?
absolutely, yeah. So I'm just going to start with chapter one, just the beginning of the book. In March 2017, my grandmother in Houston calls me in Los Angeles to tell me my mother was recently found on the side of the freeway, parked, honking her horn, her car filled with notes in which she outlined federal agents' plans to kill her. In the car was a receipt for bottled water from George Bush Intercontinental Airport over an hour away. And later we learned she spent the day there, terrified she was going to be murdered, hoping if something happened, it would be caught on a security camera. Actually, my grandmother informs me, my mother has been saying cars driven by sunglasses wearing white men have been chasing her down the highway since February. The numbers started at 10, then rose to dozens, and then to hundreds. She called and wrote notes to my grandmother's friends and colleagues, to neighbors, to strangers, detailing her persecution, leading the police to appear more than once at her home. At times, my mother was so afraid she slept in her car, not going inside to shower or change. She was fired from her nursing job after she drowned her work laptop in the bathtub. She purchased cameras to take pictures of the people following her and then threw the cameras away. She took my Aunt Tina on walks through the neighborhood and pointed out all the white cars. See, she said, how they have all their lights on in the daytime. My aunt tried to tell her the lights were a feature of the cars and not an element of some conspiracy, but my mother did not believe her. She was committed to the psychiatric ward at Bayshore Medical Center, a hospital outside the city. The hospital called Aunt Tina, who called my grandmother, who tried to get my mother released the following morning, but was not allowed to see or speak to her. Nurses injected her with medication that put her to sleep for 48 hours. When she woke up, she called my grandmother and asked, "What happened? Who said someone wanted to kill me?" My grandmother and Aunt Tina told her the truth, which was that nobody aside from my mother herself believed anyone wanted to kill her. Since coming home from the hospital, my grandmother tells me my mother is back to normal, looking for a new nursing job. She blames the Houston traffic and the onset of menopause. She says the psychiatrist who released her diagnosed her as severely depressed. I hang up awash in guilt, open the calendar on my phone, and try to remember what I was doing for the night she was in the hospital and I didn't know. A friend directed a Schubert performance by the Los Angeles Philharmonic that I wanted to go to, but ultimately skipped in favor of working on the novel I'd been trying to finish for years. I was home writing and feeling bad about not going to the symphony, while my mother was in a car on the side of a highway begging someone to save her life. I remember an odd phone conversation with her the week before last. She called to apologize for something she once said that hurt me. It was the first time we'd spoken in a while, and that phone call, combined with this new information, suggests conclusions I don't feel quite ready to accept. I'll stop there.
Mhm. I know she was somewhat unusual in having a severe break later in life, that tends to be associated with late teens, early 20s periods. But I wonder if looking back on your own upbringing and childhood with her as a single parent, you have any sense of little things that make it less surprising that that happened? Can you put a kind of string through all of that, or is it just shocking?
No, there were signs, but like I was saying before, like we were saying, there was no language for this. It was just always, my mom, she would yell at me, she would get angry over things that hadn't happened or that she seemed to just make up. And I would be confused and thinking, did I miss something? And then she would just rant and scream and scream and scream over just the smallest things. I remember one time I tried to put this in the book and I couldn't because it didn't make any sense when you write it down. But there was a luggage mixed up at the airport and someone accidentally took my luggage and she was so angry with me. um, because of this luggage mix up, which was not my fault and had nothing to do with me and was just an accident. But I mean, it's all, I think she had undiagnosed borderline personality disorder. I'm almost certain it's textbook. But it was always just, oh, she can't handle a lot of stress or she's just kind of mean. You know how people
Mhm.
justify things like this in their own families because
Sure.
you don't want to believe what you're seeing in front of your face.
But then also inside of a child, I can understand why your choice would be to not trust your own reality, to distance yourself from actually experiencing what's happening because you can't, it's chaos, right?
Yeah.
I can understand the choices you made psychologically in that kind of environment. Is that part of what you had to dig into to begin to uh, find your way through?
I would say I wasn't even aware that I had been making those choices until I wrote this book. I think I was kind of living in a kind of willful blindness to all of it. And then as I started putting the pieces together, that's all happening in real time as you read the book. I'm realizing, oh, wait, none of this was correct. None of this was chaos. And I was, I there's a reason I am the way I am today. There's a reason this anxiety comes from somewhere. So I'm having those revelations with the reader.
That's very illuminating because I've read a lot of books about childhood trauma that then people figure out, you know, uh, go through a process to come to terms with. But the thing that struck me about your book is how deeply you were able to go into that process. And now you're telling me you were sharing the process while it was happening. So it makes total sense to me that, of course, then it's more immediate, it's more raw, it's more, kind of visceral because you were actually in it and then chose to share it. Let's take a break and come back to choosing to share it, shall we? Listeners, you can find links at my website. That's goodgriefwithcheryl.com. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, etc. And to find Sarah LaBrie, you can go to sarahLabrieLivesInLosAngeles.com. Is that the best address, Sarah?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And it's LABRIE, and everything is all swooshed together. We'll be back soon. Welcome back. This is Cheryl Espinosa Jones, and I've been talking with Sarah LaBrie about her book, No One Gets to Fall Apart. And before the break, we were touching on the fact that you kind of wrote the book in real time. I'm sure you edited a lot after that. Having written a book, that's the harder part, you know, but in a way, but maybe not in this case because you were just pouring out very painful things and finding your perspective as you were writing it. So, how did you come to want to share it? Because that could have been a journal, right? But it's
Yeah.
a beautiful book.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I I thought the novel that I was working on, it was a campus novel called The Anatomy Book about a graduate student and his assistant researcher who figure out the secret to traveling through the multiverse. And um, this book, No One Gets to Fall Apart, is also about the process of trying to write that book and having it fall apart. But I thought that novel was going to be like the thing that gave me a writing career and all there was all this stuff I hoped for it. And it became very clear that none of that was going to happen. And then I started writing this book just to kind of clear my brain, and also because I was so frustrated that I couldn't find any information that I needed. And then at a certain point, once it became clear that No One Gets to Fall Apart had the momentum that I had wanted for that first book, and that it was going to sell, and that it was going to get published, and kind of all this stuff that I hadn't really expected to happen, I realized, okay, well, if there's somebody else out there who's in their 30s and their mom is suddenly diagnosed with schizophrenia, which, as you said, usually manifests in someone's early 20s. And so they're running around talking to professionals who are all just like, well, this is, we don't know anything about this. We can't help you. At least like my book will exist as like an authentic chronicle of what that moment looks like and feels like. And the few resources that are available, like there's NAMI, right? The National Alliance for Mental, I can never remember what the I stands for, but it's a nonprofit that does,
Illness, mental
yeah,
illness.
yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. They do these free support groups, and so there's that, and that's national, and they have them in community centers and Mind Med in a nursing home. Um, so that's incredible. There are books out there, but you have to know where to look. And so I thought, okay, well, this can be a resource for other people. When other people are doubting themselves, maybe this book will help them. And then also, if you've never experienced schizophrenia, when you first see it, your first instinct, I think, or my first instinct, was to be like, this isn't happening. This is a joke. This isn't real. This will go away. You just want to look away. And you can't, because schizophrenia will just progress. It'll just get worse and worse if you don't take medication. So I wanted people to, if they saw the signs, to know immediately, like, oh, okay, this is happening and this is what that is. And it's actually very prevalent. It's widespread. There's so many people I know who worked on this book, who have read it, have come to me and said, this happened to my aunt. This happened to my cousin. This happened to my brother. This happened to my dad. We didn't know what was going on. So it's so common, but I think people are so afraid of it. No one knows how common it is because there's just not a larger conversation about it.
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of the motivating factor. At a certain point, I was just, I don't know, I was just like, I need to contribute in some way to the literature that's out there about this.
That also is familiar to me from myself and from doing this show for a long time with people who have experienced big loss. If you really dive in and you really go through it, at some point you want to give something. You want to be of help, right? Because you'd like to make it a little easier for somebody else, and everyone is saying, I wrote the book I wanted. Um, but I think between all of the books, what we have is a body of literature about grief now. That even if the story isn't the same, there are familiar aspects. I'd like to move to talking about the impact of love. I know in my own process of grief, the person who inspired me to do this work, my first wife, um, helped me to touch places that I didn't know how to touch before that, because she was there. I could completely trust her, right? And I got that feeling about your husband, who at the time you were originally writing was your boyfriend. But trusting someone when you're not used to trusting someone is really difficult, right? So talk about him a bit and that relationship, and then I'll have you read what I think is the culmination of being able to trust somebody, actually asking them, to reflect on you and tell you the truth about you, right? So let's start with you and him, though, because he's so big to me in the book.
Yeah, he's I call him Ethan in the book because I changed everyone's names, but his name is Justin. It's so funny. I visited a book club the other day, and one of the ladies in the club was like, "Wow, you put that man through a lot." It's like, yeah, I did, I do. Um,
Probably
but
the other way around, too. I mean,
absolutely on a different level, not in exactly the same way, but you see it in the book. I really did try to show, he's incredible in that he's so selfless and so thoughtful and so patient and has so much grace. But our relationship wasn't perfect. I mean, there's all kinds of flaws in both of us, and that we needle each other and we fight. But it's just there is this sort of consistent well of love that he is capable of giving, and I'm so grateful. And I wanted to include that just to show also that getting through all of this, not just negotiating my mom's mental illness, but also coming to terms with how she treated me when I was a child and the abuse. And I could not have done that by myself. But that was fully that I put so much of that. I have so much gratitude to him for just being this. If my mom was sort of the chaotic force that marked the first 18 years of my life, like Justin and I met when I was 23, like he's been the stabilizing force that kind of counteracted that and allowed me to have a foundation to build a life and a career, like a successful adult life on. And just having been loved in that way, and not, not just Justin, but my grandmother, my aunt, I knew what being loved well and loving other people looked like and felt like. And I think that's why I was able to try and find a way out of my own mental illness, and
Mhm.
towards my mother, and a better understanding of our relationship.
It just seems so powerful to me that because I don't know if you know Francis Weller's book, but one of the things he says, "The Wild Edge of Sorrow" is the name of the book. I talk about it a lot on this show because I admire him a lot. And he says there's a part of grief that can only be done alone, and there's a equal part of grief that can only be done in with people in community, with love. And that's kind of a perfect example, isn't it? So let's have you share the part of the book where you actually ask him what's wrong with you. Am I saying it correctly?
Yeah, pretty so this is a moment where one of the threads in the book is that one of my other sort of foundational relationships is crumbling. A long-term best friend who I'd kind of come up with as a writer has suddenly found massive fame and success, and in that our friendship has completely deteriorated, for a lot of different reasons. And one of them is the sort of betrayal that I felt she had kind of perpetrated against me, but was not really able to talk about with her in an honest way, which then frustrated her. So I'm kind of in the middle of that friendship breakup, my book falling apart, my mom's diagnosis, and we're visiting friends. We're looking for a wedding venue this weekend, in the book. So I will start. This is about halfway down the page on 156. Oh, and my dog has just been bitten by my friend's dog, and my dog's name is Larry Bird. So I lie with Larry Bird against my chest in the guest room, feeling her small body tremble, Ethan beside us. The bleeding stops as quickly as it started. She falls asleep, but I'm still crying. Holding her, I repeat for Ethan all the things Sadie wrote, taking pleasure in knowing her last emails to me by heart. What I want, what I think I want, I tell him, is for everyone who has ever hurt me to fall in line and explain to me explicitly what I did to deserve it. But they aren't here. The only person here is Ethan, and he is growing tired. What Sadie did is not about you. It's about her, he says. She's probably feeling vulnerable. It's psychologically dangerous to go from being normal to famous so fast. And she's taking it out on you. She might not even know it. You always think other people know so much more than you, but they don't. People grow, and sometimes in the process, they fuck up. You're the collateral damage here. No, I say, I mean it. I want you to tell me what's wrong with me. Be honest. Say it straight to my face. Well, his brow furrows. Nobody ever knows what you're thinking because you won't say. People assume you're quietly judging them, and no one likes that. You feel sorry for yourself a lot. You don't always consider other people's feelings. And I mean, when was the last time you apologized to anyone? You always expect people to give you a pass, but you're so quick to cut people off when they piss you off. You think all these crazy things are wrong with you, but you won't look at your actual faults in the face. He pauses. You're self involved. You're not very interested in other people, except in ways that directly pertain to you or your writing. Sure, I say softly. All of this sounds right. It is exactly who I am, but none of it is anything I ever plan to change. You never stick around to have the fight. There's something in your ego that won't allow you to hear what you don't want to. You disappear inside your own head. I nod and stare out the window into Ted and Diana's vast yard. What if we said fuck it and ran away somewhere? I say. What if we bought a house out here? That's exactly what I'm talking about, Ethan says. We can't afford a house. What would that even fix? I don't know, I say, but I do. I'm trying to get away from Ethan's words, from my book, from my agent, from Sadie, from my belief that I drove my mother mad and that I drove Sadie away and that I will do the same thing to Ethan. From the depression I'm always trying to give the slip. But then I remember the way my mother always told me how much she wanted to run away to Atlanta, where she would start a business, Newark, where she would be a flight attendant, Berkeley, where I would go to college, West Africa, where she would find out which country she's really from. We were always going to go somewhere, and it was always going to fix all her problems, but we never left, and nothing ever got fixed. How did I fall so smoothly into the channels carved out for me? All I've done is resist. The resistance led me here. Are you spacing out again? Ethan says. You do anything to avoid reality. Work on your novel. Finish it. Move on. You can do it. I believe in you.
Uh, I was having a conversation recently where I was talking with someone whose partner has similar quirks to my wife. And they're saying, how do you do it? Kind of thing. And I thought about it for a minute. My answer was, she's my person.
Yeah.
And that's what I hear in that
Yeah.
scene. You're each other's person, you have to sort it out. But boy, he took a chance, didn't he? Even though you literally asked him, then
Yeah.
he told you down to the details.
Yeah.
And he'd obviously thought about it.
That's absolutely.
Very well thought out.
He had it locked and loaded. No, I know. But it's like you said, when you trust someone so fully and you know that they're not trying to hurt you. I mean, all Justin ever wanted was for me to write a good book because that was what I wanted. And the whole point of all of it was for me to like achieve the thing that I wanted. And so for him, it was like, well, whatever it takes, we're gonna get you there. And that's the point. It's not about your feelings, like he's like a coach. He's like a
But
really
ironically, you just wrote you broke through by writing a book about your feelings. It kind of works both ways.
Yeah, no, it's so funny. His parents are both academic psychologists, and I think he was just raised in a household full of love and understanding and patience and talking about your emotions and feeling them and feeling through them. And so it's just second nature for him. And I'm so lucky.
Yes, and also I know that all my kids, I have three, they sometimes get really tired of talking about feelings. So he chose someone who doesn't do it all the time because
No,
that
that's
could be
true.
too much.
Exactly. That's very true. For sure. I mean, in the same way that I think we're like, we like fit together where I needed somebody who could help me process emotion and he needed somebody who wasn't all about emotion all the time. And I'm a lot better now, but I used to be like very messy and very late for things all the time. And he's like very OCD about neatness and being on time. And so even though that drives me crazy, like it does make my life better that I can be an organized adult because of
Those
him.
things we rely on also can make us a little crazy from
Yeah.
time to time. Let's go to another break and we'll come back and talk more. Listeners, you can go to goodgriefwithcheryl.com to find me and to find Sarah LaBrie, go to Sarah LaBrie lives in Los Angeles.com. Back soon. Welcome back. I've been talking with Sarah LaBrie about her book, No One Gets to Fall Apart. By the way, I love the title. I didn't mention that earlier, but it does capture the environment where you're just supposed to go forward. I think I even pulled out a quote from your grandmother about that, like we just what did she say? She said something like, we just have to go on and it'll all work out." Something like that.
She says
Um,
Black people fake it till they make it. Is
Fake it
that?
till you make it. That's what it was. Yeah. And of course, sometimes that works to get the accomplishment done,
Right.
but it doesn't work to get any kind of healing to happen.
Exactly. Yeah, that was sort of my family's credo, I think. And I didn't realize how messed up that was until I wrote the book. But when I was in college, um, sort of the first section of the book kind of details the severe depression that I entered kind of as the result of a breakup, but that was probably residual grief and trauma left over from my childhood that I hadn't confronted or processed. And I would call home crying. I went to Brown, so I was in Providence, and my family was in Texas, and all I wanted to do was go home. And I was just told over and over, no, you just fake it till you make it. You fake it till you make it. And I did, but it almost killed me. It ruined my relationship to my own emotions for decades after because I was so afraid of ever feeling sad. It's that level of depression is scarring, right? And anyone who's ever experienced it knows that you'll do anything to not experience that again. And it can restrict you in a lot of ways.
That's interesting. As somebody, I have a lot of thoughts about the difference between depression and grief. They're very different in my experience of clients, for instance. But I've noticed that people who've been deeply depressed are very, do anything to try to avoid grief. It takes a lot to
Mhm.
say yes to grief. So you must have figured out at some point, this is not depression, this is grief. Can you recall coming to that realization that actually, because grief is about having the feelings,
Mhm.
right? That there's no way through except through the feelings. Depression is about dullness more and,
Right.
a kind of deadness. But how did that differentiate for you?
I think that's sort of the underlying trajectory of the book, or maybe kind of on a meta level. I think the narrative voice definitely starts as somebody who is very removed from her emotions and unable to name them or feel them. And it's almost like I wrote my way into being able to feel and into those emotions um, through writing this book and through experiencing the events in the book because it's all so close together. I was writing as all of this was happening and then revising for years and years. Um, and so by the end of it, it's kind of like it goes the way I think about it is sort of the book starts in these sort of muted tones, and then by the end, it's in full color because it's almost like when you write your way into your emotional self and your emotional beings, it's like you're writing your way into existence. Like by the end of it, I felt like, oh, I can stand up in the world and I can trust myself. And these things that I had doubts about in my childhood did happen and they were wrong. And I have a narrative that I've built around them that's mine, that I can hold on to, that is my truth. And just the act of telling that story, I think, does what you're saying of moving from depression to like the expression of emotion and the feeling of it.
I don't know if this is true for you, but one thing I discovered in being taking a deep dive into grief is that my internal territory is safe.
Hmm.
Even though I'd had therapy before, it was always to deal with my emotions so I wouldn't have to have them anymore. You know, but after that, I felt like, oh, it's okay in there. Like it
Mm.
knows what it's doing, a whole bunch more. Did that come about for you too?
I think, yes, more specifically through ketamine therapy, which is something that I kind of found my way through a friend. And because I had done cognitive behavioral therapy and all of the sort of I'd read all the books and meditation, and not that that stuff doesn't help, but I didn't want to be on medication for the rest of my life. I felt like therapy helped when I was in therapy and for like a few hours after, but then I would forget what I had figured out. So I wanted to kind of change my brain. And so I did ketamine therapy, which is where a doctor injects you with a hallucinogen, and then you hallucinate, and then you have therapy about your hallucinations. And that helped me really get a sense of my internal landscape and a physical place inside me where like there is just pure love and pure safety and this like elemental sense of security that I can access now because I visited it in my ketamine hallucinations. I can now access it through meditation, and I just have to remember that there
Well,
is.
that's kind of experiential body based too. The way I think about that therapy, it's happening in your body, not just you're not just thinking about it. But it must have felt a little risky because the whole problem with your mom was delusions, which are a little similar to hallucinations. The difference being the person who's got schizophrenia doesn't come out of it and doesn't have a base in this reality so much. But did it feel risky to you to go in that direction and to trust your hallucinations?
Did it with the company of a really good therapist who had, was licensed in this, had set up her practice around it, had been doing it for years. It came highly recommended, had a long wait list, all of the sort of professional accoutrements that you want. And we did therapy together for 4 months before I ever did ketamine. So I really trusted her and I felt like I was in good hands. But again, it's like that community, right? You have to process these things with someone. And so I felt like I was in safe hands. I would not have just done it on, ordered one of those kits that you can get online and done it myself.
No, never a good plan. It's powerful. It's powerful stuff. I'm recalling way back when I was in graduate school, decades and decades ago, one of the professors said that the difference between schizophrenia and religious experience, like metaphysical experience, was only staying aware of the fact that there's a shared reality on Earth, that there's a difference, and that sort of applies to what you're describing there.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's a whole other thing. I think I know, like you were talking about your client, you knew that she believed her hallucinations were real even though no one else could see them. I know that my mom believed that her delusions were absolutely real, and who's to say that they weren't, right? Like what is real? If she believes they're real and she lives in that world, then they're real, and denying them isn't going to do anything. There's no point. And that's scary because then it leads you to think about like, okay, well, how do we know the whole world isn't a delusion? Or I don't know. I use this as an example sometimes, but like I'm vegan. I've been vegan for a long time, and the idea of anyone eating meat or accepting factory farms as just a fact of life to me seems psychotic. But it's not psychotic to my husband. It's not psychotic to most people. But so I'm living in a completely different reality from most people, and I accept that. I know I'm aware of that. But really, how is it that different?
Yeah. I was part of a spiritual community for a long time that honored people's there was a specific name for people who live in a different reality, and they were considered holy people and they had special roles. And when I was participating in that, and then I knew some of them in everyday life, they struggled a lot, right? And I was thinking, what would it be like if the world we live in every day made a space for that? Wouldn't their experiences be different? And I think about that with your mom too. She was right that she was in danger, right? And then her actual visions reflected the danger she felt. Um, but what if she hadn't been in danger? What would her visions have been then?
Exactly. It's impossible to say. It's the way I know it's not the same disorder, but sometimes when people get dementia, there are people who suffer terribly, and there are people who are fine. Like they don't remember things, they don't quite know what's going on, but as long as they have their routine and a safe place to be, they aren't miserable. So it's just it is interesting. It's like I believe that my mom was basically living in the equivalent of like a waking nightmare, but when we have nightmares, they're usually based on something in our real life. It comes from it's rooted in reality. It comes from somewhere. And she just couldn't wake up, which is why it's also terrifying because it just feels like, oh, any one of us could just, this could happen to anyone at any time.
It felt to me as if you came to a place where you could offer understanding to her and not try to fight with what she was experiencing, whereas your grandmother, maybe some other relatives, continued to try to convince her that what she was experiencing wasn't real. And I found that very powerful. When you were talking to your grandmother about just tell her you understand that must be so painful, right? And it's the same thing with dementia. If you're embraced in love in the experience you're having, you tend to be the person who's fine.
And that's interesting. That's well, that's actually a practice that I had learned from a book that Nami recommends called "I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help." It's a guide that a psychiatrist wrote. I think his son had schizophrenia, and so his best practices were to validate their feelings, partner to try and find a solution, ask questions, and I think that was easier for me because we talked about my grandmother's avoidance and the way that she had to survive. I think for her that meant that reality had a very rigid structure and there
Mm.
were rules and you followed them. And that was how you got from day to day and you built your business and you kept your family safe. But I have been a writer for so long, I've lived in these fantasy worlds. It's just delusional to even decide to become a writer and think you can yourself. So I think that those sort of boundaries of what reality is were much more open to me and permeable and just different ways of existing and trying to live. I don't know. I there were things that I think seemed impossible to my grandmother that I understood were not impossible and that were in fact happening.
And also, you engaged in a very deep therapy process, and it tends to give people more room for scary experiences in others
Mhm.
because you know your own territory better. This is what I believe anyway. What do you think?
Absolutely. I think a good therapeutic relationship where you can really plumb the depths of yourself, like it widens your sphere and your understanding of everyone else's lives as well.
And so we leave it at the point where your mother was not going to take medication, but we also leave it at the point where you sorted yourself out and are living the life you want, even though. And I think that's very powerful. So thanks for being here today. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Uh, Listeners, be sure and go find Sarah LaBrie and look for her memoir, No One Gets to Fall Apart. Thanks so much for being with me today. This has been Good Grief. I look forward to being with you again next week for another meaningful conversation.